What's going on, guys? It's Fantasy Stock Exchange here, bringing you another installment of our ADP battle series we do over here at the Fantasy Stock Exchange YouTube channel. Today, I'm joined by none other than my boy Sexy Pats. How you doing today, Jared?
Doing great. Glad to be here.
For sure. And if you guys don't know Jared, make sure you go give him a follow on Twitter. Big Sharp over here. And yeah, it's going to be fun competing with you in TOTS this year. A little quick shout out to that.
Yeah, you kind of embarrassed yourself in the final last year. You have to get redemption this year.
Facts, yeah. That team just got absolutely depleted if you guys need any type of context. But yeah,
No,
today.
the only context you need is Alvin Kamara was on his team and he still lost.
All right. Anyways, with that being said, let's talk about the subject of discussion today. The subject of discussion is actually two NFC East wide receivers currently going off the board within 2 picks of each other. Amari Cooper being the wide receiver 11, 32nd overall off the board, and Terry McLaurin being the 34th overall player off the board, wide receiver 13. But before we get into that battle, I'm going to hit the intro. Okay, so let's start off with Terry McLaurin, and this is your pick of the discussion today. Jared, what are your thoughts on this battle, and why do you prefer Terry McLaurin here at ADP comparative to Cooper?
I've been a big fan of McLaurin pretty much ever since he came into the league. Last season, he had a pretty decent stat line considering the situation he had. 134 targets, 87 receptions, 1,118 yards, and 4 touchdowns. Finishes the wide receiver 20 in PPR. Now, obviously, Cooper has been in the league for a lot longer than McLaurin. McLaurin, third year. And I think there's a lot of good things that can happen for McLaurin this season. Like, if you look back to last year, he had 4 quarterbacks starting for him. Now he's got Ryan Fitzpatrick there. And I think that's a pretty secure quarterback, even though a lot of people don't really consider him that great. But let's look at like Devontae Parker, for example, when Fitzpatrick was in Miami. In 2019, when Ryan Fitzpatrick started from week 7 to 17, Devontae Parker had 18 PPR points per game versus 9.5 in the 6 games without him. And then in 2020, he had 14.4 PPR points per game in the 8 games with Fitzpatrick versus just 8.5 with Tua. So clearly, Ryan Fitzpatrick knows how to work with a wide receiver one. He can get somebody elite numbers, and I think Terry McLaurin is going to do that this year with him.
Yeah, no, that's definitely fair. I mean, you're talking about a guy in Terry McLaurin who his ADP's wide receiver 13. I currently have him ranked as my 13th overall wide receiver. I think the talent is there, the situation is there, and I do think he's got the potential to build off of those numbers that he saw last year, being the wide receiver 29 in PPR and wide receiver 20 in PPR in 2019 and 2020, respectively. My main thoughts on McLaurin, again, great player, one of the top charted players that Matt Harmon of Reception Perception has really ever charted. I mean, this guy is in the mid 90th percentile in terms of both against man and press coverage. You guys should be able to see that on the screen. But the way I look at it is TMC, don't get me wrong, like he's a great player, 1,100-yard receiver. The problem that I kind of have with him is when you're comparing it to the situation of Cooper, I'm going to get into Cooper in a little bit as well. You're comparing similarly talented receivers, in my opinion, except one has a much better quarterback, in my opinion, and one has a much better offense around him on both similar volume. So that's kind of where I'm at. Again, I love both these guys. They're both Cooper wide receiver 11, McLaurin wide receiver 13 for me. It's kind of hard for me to go from where he was last year, again, wide receiver 20, to automatically hail him as a top 10 option just because he went from a terrible quarterback situation. But is Ryan Fitzpatrick really going to be that sustained top 15, top 10 type option that you would need to get out of a top 8 to 10 wide receiver? That's kind of where I'm at with it.
He's definitely going to be a lot better than any of those 4 quarterbacks he had last year. But also, like, something you have to look at with Terry McLaurin, it was back in March. There was a report that came out. Terry McLaurin says he played through 2 high ankle sprains in 2020, which that's like, if you look at Kamara, when he had the high ankle sprain in 2019, his points per game dipped by like 6 points. So it's definitely an injury that you can play through, but it definitely impacts your fantasy points. And Terry McLaurin, before that injury, we don't know exactly when it happened. We believe it was week 11. If you look at his numbers before that week, he was at 17.4 PPR points per game, weeks 1 to 10, which is on pace for wide receiver 6. So he definitely has that top 10 wide receiver upside. And if he can do that with those quarterbacks, he could even be potentially top 5 with Ryan Fitzpatrick.
Yeah, I mean that's fair too. Again, when you do compare it to Cooper, again, I'm going to talk about Mclaurin in depth right now too, because the talent is absolutely there. I do think that this guy with Ryan Fitzpatrick can develop into that 1,300-yard quarterback. But when you're talking about in terms of the expected point outcome of this offense, realistically here, it's not going to be that of Dallas in terms of scoring opportunity. And we're talking about a guy who only has 11 career touchdowns. I know that's a very nitpicky type of stat to do, but when you're comparing elite wide receivers at the top of the third round, you have to be nitpicky in comparing it. So overall, we'll get back into Mclaurin in a bit. I'm going to quickly go on my classic Cowboys tangent. It's going to come off. I get it. I'm a Cowboys fan. Guys, deal with it. But Amari Cooper was evidently a better player when Dak Prescott was in the lineup. So you guys can see these splits on the screen. But those first 4 games, I know I've mentioned it multiple times. He was just an absolute looking like a league winner at that point. I mean, this guy was on a wide receiver 3 overall PPR pace, averaging over 21 PPR points per game. For reference, that is just in the ballpark of what Tyreek Hill was able to do across the season. So we saw it. He was there. He was playing like that alpha wide receiver one that Dallas was looking for when they did acquire him at the trade deadline in 2018. But when you're looking at it, I get it. The offense was Dak was throwing the ball 51 times per game. He's throwing the ball at a 50.25% or 50.25 attempt per game clip. And we saw that with Cooper's targets. I mean, 12.75. I get it. That's going to be unsustainable across a full season. But when you actually compare the overall outlook of Dak, the Cowboys passing offense in general, while the overall volume may go down, I mean, we're talking about 50.25 passing yards, nearly 425 passing yards per game. I get that. However, Dak's touchdown rate was only at 4.5% last year. For reference, a guy in Josh Allen had nearly a 6.5% clip. So I do think Dak should see positive regression in that regard. I mean, we're talking about a guy the years prior was always hovering around that 5.5%, 6% threshold that he was hitting in previous seasons. And when you're talking about Cooper himself, again, he was still able to produce. I mean, he's the wide receiver 15 overall. Yes, he wasn't the same player when Andy Dalton was in the lineup. He wasn't that guy that was going to be that sustained wide receiver 2, sustained wide receiver 1 for you. But in general, the fact that he only played 4 games with Dak and was still able to finish as a top 15 wide receiver. We're talking about a guy who was a top 10 wide receiver 2 years ago in a full season with Dak. Now only has an improved offensive situation around him. I think that he could potentially have league winning type of upside at that late 3rd round pick. And while I get the regression should happen, again, overall volume, you're already getting that discount where he's currently going off the board. Because if this guy was able to do what he was doing with Dak last year for the full sustained period, I'll tell you what, this guy would be a mid-second, high 2nd round type of pick, given that everybody knows this offense can be able to put up points. So overall, if I'm looking at similarly talented players, just give me the one with the better quarterback, the better offensive situation, and one that I can project forward as, in my opinion, both having a higher ceiling and floor given the situation.
I like Dak not Dak, Cooper as well. Like I think he's got a very solid floor, similarly to Mclaurin. Just I don't think he has the ceiling that you think he does. Like sure, in those 4 games with Dak, he was absolutely incredible. Like as you said, like 21 fantasy PPR points per game. But we have a full season of them together in 2019 when Dak was the quarterback 2. And in that season, Cooper went 119 targets, 79 receptions, 1,189 yards, and 8 touchdowns. Which that's really good, but that's still just the wide receiver 10. And that's with Dak being the quarterback 2. So we know what Cooper is. He hasn't been better than that. That was his best season of his career. So he could do better than that this season, but the odds of it happening, I just find to be way too low compared to Mclaurin.
The one thing I can quickly rebuttal on that, I know we're kind of going back and forth, but that's what ADP battle is all about. You're talking about players at such succinct ADPs. You got to break it down needle for needle, hair for hair. And the way I'm looking at Cooper, again, you mentioned only 119 targets. He had over 130 last year with that higher volume, despite Andy Dalton being in the game for the majority of the season. And when you're talking about Amari Cooper, you mentioned that wide receiver 10 finish. Well, Dak only threw the ball 596 times that year. And that was with a much improved defense. We're talking about a defense that was in the top 15 overall in DVOA, yards allowed passing yards allowed, rushing yards allowed. Overall, this was a much better defense in 2019 comparatively to what we should expect in 2021. Yes, I am a bullish Cowboys fan, but there's no shot we're jumping up from the 32nd defense this past season to being above the top 20 defense. I just don't see it.
Defense is going to be so bad again.
Like, and if that's the case, I mean, Dak threw the ball 596 times. Yes, that is elite volume for a passing quarterback, but I wouldn't be shocked if we're talking about a guy nearing that 650, 660 type range. And that is a far cry from the 804 pace he was on just last year. So overall, you guys have already heard, I think Dak has a really good shot at winning the MVP this year. And his wide receiver one, in my opinion, is going to offer league winning type of upside with it.
But that's the question also. Is he the wide receiver one? Look at what CeeDee Lamb did last year. Like, as a rookie, he still put up 111 targets, 74 receptions, 935 yards, 5 touchdowns. Like, CeeDee Lamb could easily take over that wide receiver one role, or at least be the 1B to Amari Cooper's 1A. And if that's the case, then this upside that Dak is going to have in terms of attempts will just go towards Lamb instead of Cooper. Like, Cooper's still going to have that same floor, a similar ceiling with that upside in attempts, but Lamb's going to be the one to take more of it. And I think, like, if there's either of those two, if they're going to take over that wide receiver one role, I think it's going to be Lamb.
Potentially. I mean, I think Lamb may produce him from the yardage perspective, maybe the touchdown perspective, but we're still talking about Amari Cooper, who was a near 26% target share guy last year, even with CeeDee Lamb in the offense, Blake Jarwin for a game, Dalton Schultz, and of course, Michael Gallup. For sure, I do think that 25% may adjust to maybe, let's say, a 22, 23% clip, while CeeDee Lamb does take a little bit more of that pie. But ultimately here, you're getting one of the safest assets in fantasy. I mean, we saw overall last year, he kind of dispelled that quote unquote boomer bust narrative when Dak was in the lineup, because this guy just saw plentiful volume to be able to produce those type of numbers. So overall, and you mentioned the 2019, this is a guy who was ailed throughout the season. I mean, we're talking about a guy who was dealing with multiple ankle sprains, was kind of dealing with inconsistencies. Dak had dealt with an AC joint sprain against the Eagles. So overall, again, I know it's being nitpicky, but I do think that he kind of has, since he's gotten into Dallas, dispelled that Raiders, Amari Cooper, inconsistent player narrative that we saw really from 2015 to 2017. So overall, I think Amari Cooper is the wide receiver one that typically doesn't get the value or the hype that he deserves, because he's just kind of boring. People know what you're going to get with Amari Cooper. He's probably going to be in that wide receiver 8 to 10 type range this year again. But I do think that the upside is higher comparatively to what we've seen in recent years. So if I'm going to have to nitpick, if I'm going to have to take an edge, I'm going to take the one with the guy and Amari Cooper I believe more in personally. But I guess
we'll have to agree to disagree there, because
for sure,
I'm just massive on Terry McLaurin this year. I think he just has elite upside, and as we see with the Matt Harmon reception perception, like, he was an absolute superstar in terms of the metrics he put up there, like 97 percentile, 90 percentile versus man or press. Like, he was double covered at a rate similar to elite alpha wide receivers. This guy is just so underrated as a talent in this league, and honestly, I think he's a better talent than Amari Cooper at wide receiver.
That's a little subjective, but I do see it. I think they're both in that wide receiver one alpha type of tier as talent. So again, if you guys have made it this far in the video, you've enjoyed the content so far, comment down below ADP Battles episode 2. And also, who do you guys prefer? Amari Cooper or Terry McLaurin? Anyways, thank you for making it. And thank you, Jared, for coming on. We're definitely going to be doing some more with you this offseason. But that being said, we'll see you guys next week for the next installment of ADP Battles, where Butch is going to be hopping on his own guest. So make sure you go watch that. Anyways, peace out, y'all.